Hello and welcome. My name is Simon French and I'm Chief Economist at Panmure Gordon. Today we're going to take a look at what the long-term impacts of COVID-19 around the world are going to have on economic behaviour, both by businesses and consumers, and crucially, how investors will respond to those changes. So the first thing to note is that government deficits around the world have radically increased over the last quarter and are expected to continue to grow for the rest of the year, as they deal with compensating businesses and consumers for what has been an unprecedented shutdown. The legacy of those deficits will mean that central banks will have to remain quite active in asset buying and keeping interest rates low, to keep those borrowing costs constrained for both governments and the corporate sector. And they will have to hope that those structural low inflation factors of the last 2 to 3 decades will continue. There are good reasons to believe they will, and we believe that while inflation will rebound a little bit in 2021 and into 2022, it'll be relatively modest and will be largely base effects rather than an inflationary spiral that some investors may remember from the late 1970s and early 1980s. The second thing to note is probably more asset specific, and this is certainly has real relevance for real estate investors, is the changing behaviour in terms of prevalence to go into offices and to do online retailing versus bricks and mortar, visiting shopping centres and high streets. And clearly there will be a different density required in the short term, consistent with social distancing, but also longer term, consumers having familiarised themselves with home working and indeed with online retailing may find those behaviours quite sticky, as they've invested time and effort to adjust their home and adjust their shopping habits, and may find that reverting to pre-COVID levels, even as the economy reopens and potentially under a vaccine, won't be particularly desirable. Indeed, they might like the new way of doing things. Thirdly, I'd look at data sharing. One of the constraints that governments around the world have had is insufficient data around citizens' movements, and indeed businesses and their business composition to be able to stand up an immediate healthcare response to a pandemic, but also target financial support to businesses. And therefore, I think businesses and investors should get used to the requirement from the public sector for more data to enable them to better target in the event of a secondary outbreak or further pandemic type events. And then fourth and finally, I'd look at the legacy of shorter supply chains. This is certainly something that the US and China, in the context of their trade war, were pushing for, certainly on the US side. I think that's going to now spread to Europe and around the world, both from a sustainability standpoint, but also from a strategic standpoint, trying to accelerate the recovery in their borders rather than having any stimulus spillover effects leak into other economies, but also from a perspective of preserving strategic capacity in the healthcare space, industrial space to respond if there is disruption to the international trading system. So all in all, some quite significant long-term changes, I believe, coming from COVID-19 that will long last even when the virus comes under control.